Why don't we begin? First of all, thank you all for coming to the Tower Center for a special event tonight. Thanks students especially for making it. We realize this is midterms week and students are running around in a deep panic. For those of you who were able to come out, thank you very much for attending. We worked for a while.
Okay.
For those who are new, welcome to the Security and Strategy program here at the Tower Center at SMU. The topic tonight is killer robots, and that's a provocative phrase. It sounds like a movie. And there are many sorts of weapons out there. There are all sorts of different weapons. Most of them arouse very little controversy. Others, on the other hand, will arouse intense public interest and generate very controversial and heated debates. Think, for instance, about drones or chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. Arouse very passionate debates on both sides of the issue. This is one of those cases. The issue of autonomous weapon systems has already generated a great deal of heated debate, which is showing no sign of letting up anytime soon. And it's not hard to understand why that's the case. When you say autonomous weapons and you say killer robots, what's the first thing that pops in your mind? Probably the Terminator. Hollywood, the idea of a robot, an autonomous system making decisions about life and death. That's a little bit, it makes for great sci-fi, but it's a little bit scary, and for some it's very problematic. One of the questions we're going to explore tonight is whether or not these fears are realistic, or whether they are nightmare scenarios which are sort of divorced from technological reality. We're going to ask some other questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time for you to ask your questions as well. What are the strategic implications of these weapons? How does this affect how we think about the conduct of war? What are the legal implications of autonomous systems? What are the ethical questions at stake here as well? And as is our normal practice at the Tower Center, we always like to get at least two voices on the same question. And we like to get them from very different backgrounds, and that's no different tonight. On my far right is Professor Michael Horowitz of the University of Pennsylvania, a political scientist, specialist on strategy and technology, previously served in the Department of Defense and the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and remains part of the Ethical Autonomy Project at the Center for New American Security, where he's also a senior fellow. To his left is Chris Jenks, assistant professor of law here at SMU, with a background in the Army. Served as an Army JAG for a long time, also a legal advisor to the State Department, and who's studied this issue in considerable depth. We're going to start with Professor Horowitz on the broad issue of killer robots, strategy and policy. Then we're going to move over to Professor Jenks. Each will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will open it up for a very lively, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, and thanks, Professor Rubner, for inviting me. I've never been to SMU before. You have an awesome campus, seriously, compared to the cinder block that I work in Philadelphia. It is ridiculously beautiful here, and thank you all for coming out today. I've spent a lot of my career working on issues surrounding military innovation, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you about what many worry is the next thing coming down the pipeline, that being killer robots. Professor Rubner mentioned the Terminator, but many of you probably late last spring saw this movie, The Avengers, where what happens? Well, essentially the classic trope of Hollywood, which is that you invent a robot, you give it a brain, you give it a gun, and of course the first thing it decides is humanity's got to go. What does it say about us, by the way, just for the record, that our vision of the world is essentially that if you give somebody else a brain and a gun, they'll kill us? I don't know. So, are the robots really out to get us? Obviously reality is going to be a bit more complicated, and the academic question or the policy question, the question you think about in the Department of Defense in some ways, is this one. It's sort of how is the information age, and I expand here beyond autonomy to think about robotics, think about other kinds of systems as well. How is that going to shape international politics? And what you really want to know with new technologies and new innovations, if you think think about innovations is not just the new widget, but how you use it, is what kind is it going to be? So we have very different ones, and they have very different kinds of consequences. Imagine a continuum, where on the one side you have things that spread really slowly, that maybe if you're a big, powerful country like the United States, you could invent and control and no one else can get. Hey, big advantage. You know, the other is something that everybody can get. There's nothing you can do about it. All right, nuclear weapons. Spread really slowly. I mean, like North Korea demonstrated that if you put your nickels in a jar every year for 40 years, you can get a nuclear weapon. But fundamentally, they are still expensive and difficult to acquire, and have actually spread pretty slowly. Now think about advanced fighter aircraft, something that are reasonably expensive, but if you invest over time, lots of countries can get them. Now something that you can find in every city in America, around the world, even Dallas, and that's the AK-47. Something that any place around the world, you can find this. Cheap, easy to manufacture. Basically anybody can get it. So one of the things that we need to understand when thinking about new military technologies and things like the integration of autonomy in weapon systems is how quickly is something like this going to spread. That helps us figure out then the implications for international politics. And there are two key technology trends that I want to highlight at the outset here. And this sort of gives away the ending, but suggests that some of these things may spread faster rather than more slowly. Not in the Skynet way. The first is that if you think about the crux of a lot of new technology today, the emphasis is on software rather than hardware. So it's less about the platform and more about what you can program the platform to do. The second, that industry and military are focused on the same key technologies. If you think about some of the technologies that gave the United States military the edge it has today, something like stealth technology. Stealth is something that's only really useful for militaries, like making your factory disappear to radar, like only useful in a Bond movie. Something like robotics, on the other hand, is something that the commercial market for robotics is way larger than the consumer market. When Google bought like 18 robotics companies a couple of years ago, it basically pulled a lot of them out of the defense sector. Not because it had a beef with the Defense Department, but because it thought that the consumer and private sector market was just bigger. And that suggests that that's the kind of technology that's going to spread around the world. It can spread fairly quickly. And then just to be clear, we're not talking here about drones. I'm happy to talk about drones in Q&A. I will prattle on about drones, I promise. But this is not really about drones. Because drones in some ways are way less magic than we tend to think that they are. They're a lot slower than inhabited aircraft. They can protect themselves. They're easy to track, etc. We're talking about sort of where things are going and where research and development investments in autonomy and robotics are going. So what will drive innovation in this area? One way to think about it. All right, so we have Baxter with the creepy eyes. Actually, I don't know whether this will actually shut this off, so I might use the pointer here. So we have Baxter with the creepy eyes on the upper left. We have, if any of you have something you call a robot in your house, it's probably a Roomba. We have delicious hamburger building robot. And then Toyota decided to build a robot that could play the violin at one point, just to demonstrate that they could. None of these things have anything to do with any militaries. Now, take a look at this video. This is a video of a coordinated flight of sort of little micro drones produced by the Grass Lab at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is sort of drones constructing. Really, whatever. They're just like building blocks. But the point being, this looks like, wow, what are they doing? And now imagine that they're not just being programmed by somebody, but they're programmed to start to make more judgments themselves about how to do things. It starts with, how do they avoid hitting each other as they're flying back and forth to pick things up and build the box? But once you can figure out how to do that, you can figure out, in theory, how to do a lot more. And so the concern that many people have is that today's experiments will be tomorrow's warriors. On the right here, we have a Japanese robot called the Kuroda, which they debuted at some consumer electronics show a couple of years ago. And it's got basically a BB gun and a Nerf rocket launcher and all those kinds of things. And they did it just to get attention, which it worked, on the slide years later. And on the left is an American company, or a couple of American companies last year. We're like, well, the Japanese built a big robot. We're going to build even a bigger robot. And they're going to try to coordinate a battle between these. And the point being that there are people people that essentially, with that kind of tone, like the kind of tone you would see like on the Sci-Fi Channel, like, oh my God, the robots are going to battle. But what does this actually mean in reality? So what is actually an autonomous weapon? The Department of Defense defines an autonomous weapon as a weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. So, essentially what it means is that a machine, rather than a person, is making the choice about what to target and about whether to actually destroy the targets. So why would you want weapons like this in the first place? We already have things like precision-guided munitions. We already have lots of weapons that employ advanced technologies that do not involve machines making choices about who lives and who dies. Well, there are a couple of reasons. First is defensive. The United States and actually 30 countries around the world have already deployed a weapon system that do just this over the last 30 years. That's called the Phalanx. It's a weapon system that sits on ships and basically protects ships from incoming missile threats. It has an automatic mode you can flip on, so that if the number of threats coming in is too large for any human to stop, that the machine can essentially target and fire against them. Protects U.S. soldiers. Sounds great, right? No one's objected to this for 30 years. There are clear defensive reasons why you might want these systems. There are potentially offensive reasons as well. One of the big concerns that the United States military has about potential future conflicts is that our reliance on things like satellites and sort of bandwidth connectivity, the thing that makes the magical internet go, that all of that could be at risk if someone shoots down satellites to try and gain an advantage over the American military. Well, one thing that might be great is that if those satellites get shot down, if you have weapon systems that can still complete their mission. Or imagine that somebody else is building. And this is a classic political cartoon showing Khrushchev and Kennedy in the 1960s. That someone else has built these kinds of systems, and now they, because a computer is making a decision rather than a person, can operate faster than you. They can target faster than you. They can fire weapons faster than you. So you might want some of these to get back ahead. Because the advantage that autonomous systems potentially have is twofold. One is that they can't be hacked. Unlike today's drones, where there's a data link between the controller and the platform that can be hacked, can't hack an autonomous system. It's just a box. The second is speed. Using computers, you can make decisions much faster. So why don't we already live in a world with robotic weapons all over the place? Well, there are practical reasons, and there are certain ethical and moral reasons. Start with the ethical and moral reasons. And I'm happy to cover this more in questions, although it's not the focal point of my presentation. There's a fundamental concern that many have raised that humans have a right to be killed by a person. And that there's something less dignified, essentially, about being killed by a machine that makes a calculation rather than being killed by a person. This is not a statement that people universally agree with. I'm just sort of laying out the argument. And there are other concerns that Professor Jenks can get more into that have to deal with the ability of these sorts of weapons to actually comply with international law. But there are practical concerns as well. I don't know if you remember this. This was a terrible moment for the American stock market. This was the flash crash. When, due to a trading algorithm gone awry, the stock market loses a ton of value before rebounding. It demonstrated essentially some of the technological risks inherent in high-frequency trading. What happens if an autonomous weapon goes awry? You try to program some of these systems as best you can to do the best they can, but if they get in complicated environments that are beyond the scope of their programming, what happens? So a big concern about these kind of weapon systems is that they could end up failing in a dangerous way. Danger not just enemy soldiers, but your own soldiers, your own people, as well as endangering so they wouldn't be effective essentially on the battlefield. The level of operational risk would go up. That's a real world concern. It's one of the reasons why the world is actually likely to move pretty slow in developing and deploying these kinds of systems, and why you're likely to see them sooner in environments that are more controlled, like the air, undersea, etc., rather than in something like urban combat. Like the worst fear that groups have is that there's like an actual Terminator-like robot like roaming around the city, like looking for me. I'm not because I'm great or anything, but imagine. I mean, and that goes back to the simple equation that I talked about at the outset. Take a robot, give it a brain, give it a gun. What do you get? You get the apocalypse. Not just the Terminator. It's not just the Avengers. It's the Matrix. It's Battlestar Galactica. It's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Pretty much the only movie where we let the robots think and like do some things. They don't try to kill us all. Is Wall-E. Like Wall-E, great robot. Who knows what would happen to be Wall-E? None of them. But the point being that this is the scenario that many have laid out, arguing that despite some of the strategic advantages that we could get from these types of systems, those operational risks are just too high. And these are people smarter than me. Stephen Hawking, obviously smarter than me. Elon Musk, obviously smarter than me. And they signed a letter penned by something called the Future of Life Institute in late July. And the letter argued that essentially autonomous weapons are so dangerous that we should get rid of them now. Sort of two quotes. And the sort of big concern here being that what their worst case scenario is imagine the drones that the United States flies today. And now imagine that those drones could be programmed with actual somebody's face or with a marker for a particular ethnic group. And then those drones would fly around the city, killing, all of the Mike Horowitzes, or killing, all of the whatever. And so that's the fear that this group has, and they argue that to stop this from happening, we need to get rid of these weapons before they start. Because otherwise, there'll be an arms race, and, the world, gets back to the apocalypse. All right. So, very smart people, very concerned about this. Why don't we just get rid of these systems now? Why not just ban killer robots? Part of the challenge here gets back to why arms races happen in the first place, and this is the strategy element. Keeping up with the Joneses is not something that we just do in our daily lives. It's something that countries do because they feel threatened. And imagine that you're a country like the United States, and you want to have the best military. You want to have the best military in the world. And it's not America's advantage for these weapons to be invented, but what if China invents them? And you're worried about the possibility that U.S. forces in the future could have to confront a robotic army. American soldiers would die at the hands of other people's robots. But you're certainly not going to let that happen if you're the United States. And you might fear that China might not follow an arms control agreement. So maybe you're not going to be so excited about this. Another problem: how do you distinguish between a drone and a killer robot? This gets back to that problem with software that I talked about before. The difference between a Reaper, the kind of system that the United States flies, and the drone the United States flies in Afghanistan, Pakistan, allegedly other places, etc., and a killer robot is all software. It can look the same. So how do you tell the difference? The third is what I call the arms control dilemma. When arms control works, it tends to work because you're talking about technologies that are not essential to how militaries operate, or that countries decide they don't necessarily need anymore. The problem is that the more useful a military technology is, essentially the more that AI researchers are correct that killer robots are possible and really useful, the harder they are to ban, because the more countries will see it in their interest, and the more countries outside the United States. The reason is that the United States is the biggest, strongest military in the world. In some ways, if you froze global power exactly the way it is now, and froze global military power exactly the way it is now, no country would benefit more from the United States. We would lock in our advantage forever. So other countries are always looking for new technologies and new investments in the military arena to try to catch up to the United States, which is why a lot of the investments in these areas are actually happening overseas, not in the United States. And so I would suggest as a way forward that perhaps a better way to think about this is that instead of thinking about autonomous weapons as a category, killer robots as a category, we need to actually broaden our horizons a little bit and think about different types of essentially autonomous weapons. Say an autonomous missile that actually could, be programmed to tell the difference between, say, a civilian ship and a military ship. Is that really so bad? It's probably going to be more accurate. Maybe less likely to make a mistake. Maybe that helps reduce civilian casualties in conflict, the way precision-guided munitions have. Now say the Reaper on the upper right. Give that a brain. Give that a brain in maybe a confined space. Maybe not so bad. Now maybe you can correct for some of the errors in human judgment that happen from people getting tired of war. Have that thing fly around the world, looking for sort of particular people, particular things, not controlled by any person at all, just sort of pre-programmed. Starts to sound a little more dangerous. But the thing that people really worry about, and also the thing that, look, it's just not going to happen, is replacing the people at the bottom. When you really need to worry about autonomous weapons, it's actually not the upper left or the upper right. It's fundamentally, it's still people making the decisions to send those weapons off to war. It's when we start replacing people at the planning stages of warfare and using, substituting essentially algorithms for strategic planning. Like, that is actually Skynet. The good news is, the last thing militaries actually want to do is give up control of how they fight. And so, in my opinion at least, I'm less worried about that. But there are still issues with the top two things that we have to worry about. But on the other hand, robots, guns, apocalypse. And with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mark.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to Josh Rovner and the Tower Center, and to Professor Horowitz from coming down from Philly. I was actually supposed to visit Professor Horowitz last month, which I was unable to do because of Snowstorm Jonas. Now, I don't want to say that Dallas is more welcoming than Philly, but I know that there's not a cloud in the sky. It's 70 degrees. Welcome to SMU and Dallas, Professor Horowitz. My remarks this evening will address first the mechanism by which certain groups and a handful of countries are seeking to ban lethal autonomous weapons or laws. I'll then explain what makes a weapon illegal and apply that both to some past systems as well as some future systems. And then finally, I'll lay out what I see as the path ahead, why and how the U.S. and frankly most countries will continue to develop increasingly autonomous weapon systems. So the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is a consortium, if you will, of some 56 groups from around the world who, along with a handful of countries, are lobbying the world, essentially, the international community, to ban laws, lethal autonomous weapons. And they're doing so at and through a United Nations treaty body. And that is wait for this name, that is the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. And that's a treaty that was developed in 2001. It's a very wordy title, so the shorter, although somewhat awkward way to refer to it is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or CCW. Now there's a base treaty, and then there's right now 5 protocols. Those protocols deal with things like non-detectable fragments, mines and booby traps, incendiary weapons, blinding lasers, and explosive remnants. Roughly 120 countries around the world have signed up to either the base treaty or some combination of the protocols. And the United States has signed up to both the base treaty and all of the 5 protocols. So essentially, one of the goals, at least as I understand it, of the campaign to stop killer robots is there would be a 6th protocol. And that protocol would be a ban on lethal autonomous weapons or laws. So what is it that makes a weapon or weapon system illegal? Primarily, there are 2 principles that we look to when assessing the legality of a weapon. The first is the principle of discrimination. That is, can the weapon be directed accurately at a specific military objective? Essentially, can you aim the weapon system? So when you look at Iraqi Scud missiles from the Gulf War, which have only a very general guidance, you are very inaccurate system, those would be an example of an indiscriminate weapon system. The second category is that of unnecessary suffering. This gets into a, frankly, kind of a weird analysis because we have weapon systems that, of course, kill people, and that's permissible, but we regulate systems that maybe don't kill but wound you and cause unnecessary suffering. So that the test there for when a weapon system causes unnecessary suffering is, does a weapon system in its normal expected use cause injury or suffering that is manifestly disproportionate to its military effectiveness? Practically speaking, the way you might want to think of that is, does the weapon system continue to injure or wound after incapacitation? So consider poison bullets. So you shot someone with the bullet has incapacitated them, and now the poison is continuing to injure or wound them. That additional injury or wounding is the unnecessary. We can, I think, all agree. The being shot, you are going to suffer. So what we're looking at is, at what point is that suffering unnecessary? Another macabre example is the use of, say, glass in explosives as part of shrapnel. So you've been incapacitated by explosive force, but now you have shards of glass internally that are continuing to wound you, and to make matters worse, are very hard to detect. So using glass is another example of a way you can violate the principle of unnecessary suffering. So how do we apply those concepts to lethal autonomous weapons? Now remember the definition that Professor Horowitz showed of weapons which select and engage without human intervention, and while he listed that correctly as a Department of Defense definition, I think it's fair to say that that's widely accepted as a definition, although somehow what some of the terms mean in there is some disagreement. So let's talk about some prior systems. Professor Horowitz mentioned the phalanx system, which is the system on the right, which is on every U.S. Navy warship, frankly every NATO warship, and for non-allies, Russia and China, they just have the Russian and the Chinese version of the phalanx system. The phalanx system is very sophisticated in some ways, and is capable of discrimination of a kind. On the other hand, its discrimination leaves a little bit to be desired, and so the way that this weapon system is still permissible is how it's used. It's used, frankly, in the middle of the ocean, for which there is minimal risk of civilian injury. In fact, there have been untoward incidents involving the phalanx. In one of the Gulf Wars, the Iraqis fired an anti-ship missile towards a couple of British warships and a couple of American warships. All the warships took countermeasures. Some of those countermeasures entail firing of chaff, which is, think of metallic paper that you fire off from the ship to try to make the missile think, hey, that's the ship, so the missile will head that way. So as the Iraqi missile is heading towards these ships, and the USS Missouri, you recall from World War II, the USS Missouri has fired this chaff. So you have all this metallic kind of little pieces of metal floating in the air. The phalanx system on another U.S. Navy warship mistook that chaff for the missile and proceeded to put 20 depleted uranium rounds into the USS Missouri. So a rather ignoble end of, that was the last combat encounter of the USS Missouri, which was being shot by the USS Jarrett. But that lack of discrimination is not necessarily problematic from a law of armed conflict perspective because of how the system is used. It is used at sea. To the left is another system, that is the Patriot Air Defense System. It's a U.S. Army system that's used to target aircraft. Similar to, as Professor Horowitz described, of the phalanx, the Patriot has a variety of modes. And one of those is automatic. So why would you need or want an automatic mode? Well, let me tell you what the Patriot is capable of doing, and please raise your hand if you think you can do what the Patriot does, and I may have a job for you. So the Patriot is able to identify and track up to 100 aerial objects at a range of 60 miles, determine whether they are manned or unmanned. It is able to process intercept coordinates to 9 different missile systems at the same time. And it also has a mode in which it will take that next step of firing, not because a human being has pushed a button, but because the system does that, in this instance, autonomously. I think it's important in this discussion to recognize there have been untoward events. In each of the Gulf Wars, Patriot missile battery firing, not because a human being, not because a U.S. Army soldier launched a missile, but because the Patriot launched, targeted the wrong aircraft. Shot down a U.S. Navy warship, U.S. Navy aircraft, killing the U.S. Navy pilot, also shooting down a British Tornado, killing 2 pilots. 2 pilots there. So we have had these long-standing systems. We've used them largely without issue, but not completely. They are capable of discrimination, and to the extent that there are issues, those are mitigated by, again, how and where you use the system. So what about future systems? Well, I don't know. I mean, my first answer is I don't know. I need you to show me a weapon system, bring me a weapon system, and I will let you know whether there's a problem. And this reaches what I call frankly, the hubris, the intellectual arrogance that is implicit in a large part of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots call to preemptively ban future systems. In essence, what many from the campaign are saying is, I have been to the future. I have seen the future. I know how weapon systems will be developed. And even more, I can tell you now, those systems cannot possibly be capable of discrimination or not causing unnecessary suffering. And since I'm so graciously sharing that information with you now in the present, we can just avoid all of this by not developing the systems. This, of course, presupposes an ability to forecast how and when technology will progress. And if there is anything that humans do poorly, it is make predictions about technology. So I'd like to just share some predictions, and kind of like my colleague indicated, I'm willing to stipulate every one of the people who I'm about to read a prediction from, infinitely smarter than I am. The one thing that I may be slightly better than them at is I'm not going to make the mistake of making predictions like they had. In 1995, Robert Metcalfe, who invented Ethernet, predicted that the internet will, quote, collapse in 1996. Bill Gates in 2004, good news for everyone, Bill Gates in 2004 informed us all that the spam problem would not exist within 2 years. And as someone who begins each and every day by rating my inbox of the 20 to 30 emails that have populated over the night, I'm a little disappointed on that one. Now, and we didn't just become bad predictors of technology. We've always been bad predictors. We just conveniently like to forget that. The Boeing Corporation in 1933 announced there will never be a bigger plane, proudly referring to its 247 model, which could seat 10 people. The chairman of IBM, this is the company that by some accounts developed the computer. So you are smart enough to develop the computer. And the chairman of IBM in 1943 announced, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. In 1949, Popular Mechanics indicated that computers in the future may weigh no more than 1.5 tons. And this doesn't work any better, frankly, with weapon systems. The smartest people in the world from leading countries of the day gathered in The Hague in 1899. And they set their minds to look into the future, to identify what would be the next weapon system that would be developed, that the world would later say, if only we could have stopped that, prevented that weapon system from being developed. Now, bearing in mind this is 15 years before the start of World War I, the widespread use of the machine gun, of tanks, of chemical weapons and fighter planes, all of which were permissively used at the time. So what was it that had been identified in 1899 if it was not those systems? I'm of course referring to the 1899 Hague Convention on prohibiting the discharge of projectiles and explosives from balloons. So that is what, in 1899, the leading minds in the world thought was the next scourge of humanity, was people hand-dropping explosives from balloons. Ask a computer science expert, a roboticist, an artificial intelligence researcher, when they think machines will have the ability to improve themselves. And you will hear estimates from the smartest people in the world ranging from 1 to 2 decades to 1,000 years and everything in between. So you will hopefully excuse me when I question, frankly, predictions from even people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, who you saw pictured earlier. Professor Hawking has indicated that artificial intelligence, quote, spells the end of the human race. And Mr. Musk says that artificial intelligence could be more dangerous than nuclear weapons, which he likened to summoning a demon. So given all that, what is the path ahead? Frankly, it is that the military will continue to develop weapon systems, and these systems will perform more and more functions. Now, as I guess I share Professor Horowitz's view, the military is going to focus on systems that operate in spaces where there's minimal risk of civilian harm. So first will be subsurface, anti-sub robots operating underwater. Then will be the surface of the water, then high altitude, and last, if at all, will be on the ground. Interestingly, while some opponents of these systems believe that the U.S. military lays awake at night dreaming of the day when they would have so-called killer robots, if you look at what the U.S. Army, for example, is working, is concerned about, and wanting to figure out how they can counter a threat, it's not that they don't have any concerns about Chinese or Russian super robots, but the most recent war game that the U.S. Army was involved in dealt with fights over food, water in failed megacities, and needing to fight in sewers and tunnels, for which, frankly, these kinds of systems that people prophesize would be of minimal to no utility. So let me talk about what increased machine autonomy means. So what you're seeing is obviously a screen capture from a parking garage. Some of you may have seen an MIT video. It's frankly not a new video, it's several years old. And what the video depicts is MIT engineers building a plane that is able to follow its own, determine a path by which it autonomously flies through a parking garage at speeds up to 25 miles an hour, at times coming within 2 to 3 centimeters of objects. So again, this system is not being piloted by a human. Indeed, were it piloted by a human, I suspect it would have crashed very shortly. So this system is capable, simply put, of performing in a way that human beings cannot match. And that is only just the one plane. So the factors in terms of development, the first of which is swarming. And this is an image from the video that you saw earlier. So imagine not just not just my one plane that is capable of flying through a parking garage in a way that a human piloted system could not. Imagine 50 or 500 of these, again, not piloted by humans, each flying in ways beyond human capabilities, through windows, doors, and complex formations. And we should not, of course, limit our imaginations to the air. The U.S. Navy is already fielding, already testing, swarming, autonomous small attack craft. So every boat you see on the screen, there is not a human on there, there is not a human somewhere else that is piloting those systems. Those systems are navigating and performing largely autonomously. They also are equipped with weapon systems, which the Navy envisions. There would be a set of circumstances by which if a threat vessel came too close, that these systems would autonomously begin to engage. So again, a human being would not be firing, the systems themselves would perform that function. Now, I think the swarming is going to play a large function, essentially that as defenses are comprised of swarms of systems, the only way you're going to be able to attack such a system is with swarming offensive systems. But I think the pace of that is going to be largely influenced by how quickly we are or are not desensitized to this increased machine autonomy. I do think drones play a part in that. We largely aren't talking about drones tonight. Drones are generally thought of as piloted systems. So the drone is responding to commands from a human operator. But as I think everyone here knows, there are now several hundred thousand of them, of various kinds, shapes, and sizes that are operating here in the U.S. And if you have a job, a profession, or a skill that has elements of remoteness, danger, risk, or repetition, there may well be a piloted drone that you can use. And of course, these systems are not just going to be legally used. On the bottom right there, you see the results of you see the failed results of an attempt to use a drone to ferry methamphetamine across the border from Mexico to the United States. And if there's anything you should take away from my remarks tonight, it's that if you have 7 pounds of methamphetamine and a drone capable of only carrying 5, you're going to need to make 2 trips. Or come up with an explanation of what happened to these 7 pounds of meth that ended up in a supermarket parking lot. These will largely be, the commercial applications though are going to be limited. It's going to be somewhat gimmicky to start, beer delivery, taco bot, things like that. What is going to explode the commercial applications in a revolutionary fashion, and I think is going to really desensitize us, is going to be the increases in autonomy. It is when you take the human being out of piloting the system. So I've got a couple things on the screen here. The bottom is, of course, Amazon Prime Air. Amazon wants to fly. Those of us here in Dallas, I'm sure Professor Horowitz up in Philly, they want to fly you things within an hour if you live in a major urban area. And they've said they would be ready to do so sometime this year, 2016. And that system is not going to be piloted by a human. That's not cost effective. It's going to follow a program. It's going to have some kind of avoidance systems. We're still working through a lot of that. But Amazon, again, is ready this year. Now, the Federal Aviation Administration is nowhere near where Amazon would like it to be. So I think we have some ways to go before this delivery system happens. And I would tell you it's going to happen outside the U.S. before it happens in the U.S. In fact, Amazon has essentially indicated as much, stating that while they would prefer to start their autonomous Amazon Prime Air system in the U.S., if forced, they will do so elsewhere. They've currently been in Canada, improving and working on their technology. The other image I have up here is useful for me anyway, as an illustration of we cannot even imagine the uses of increased machine autonomy, and an example of that is the BeachBot. The BeachBot is an autonomous sand art robot that is used at beach resorts. So BeachBot 3 or 4 in the morning, goes out and makes beach art, the tide comes in, and then Beachbot just goes about its work. So it is really limitless, the things that are going to be done by machines now and in the immediate future. I think one of the largest indirect factors that we're going to encounter is going to be driverless cars. And the path, and what will be interesting is how much that does or does not desensitize us to our own human limitations and or what machines are capable of doing. So each major car manufacturer has indicated that they will have a system available in 1, 3, 5 years. I submit that the way this is going to work is largely like it worked with airbags. When airbags first became a thing, they were what? They were a feature. They were an added feature. It was a safety feature, but you paid $250, $500 for that feature. Now your insurance company turned around and then maybe cut you 5 to 10% off. Well, after then that became standard, we had side airbags. So for the next couple of years, you're going to see as options autonomous functions, systems and ways that the car is going to be doing increasingly more of the driving. It's nice to see some students here from the law school and some of the Tower Center and for the undergrads. With a few exceptions, most of the students I interact with disappoint me on a regular basis in that they do not get my 80s movies references, which go over their heads. So what I do enjoy telling, particularly the undergrads, is in a way to make them feel old, which is 5 to 10 years from now, you will have children. 15 years later, you will be the weird adult who is trying to explain what driving a car is to your child who is never going to drive a car. Won't even be a steering wheel in it, so you can look forward to that in the future. The number you see on the screen, 32,719, that is the number of Americans who died on roadways, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in calendar year 2014. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens, what becomes of that number. I have a short video that I'd like to show you that I think underscores a little bit about
introducing the all-new self-driving car. It does the driving for you so you can catch up on the more important things in life. It automatically takes the right turns. Effortlessly avoids unexpected obstacles. Red lights far in advance, ensuring you a perfectly safe journey every time. De zelfrijdende auto. Technologie is er klaar voor.
The reason I like that video for a couple of reasons, but principally because when I ask audiences, what did I just show you, the response is either an autonomous car ad or more specifically a Volkswagen car ad, and I just did nothing of the kind. I just showed you an insurance commercial. That video was made by a Dutch insurance company. And like so many things in life, the insurance industry is going to largely drive and help incentivize us or disincentivize us to make certain choices in life. So I envision in the not too distant future, when you call the insurance company about your new car and wanting insurance, you're going to have a lot of the same conversation. Tell me about your car, how many miles, city, highway, and then you're going to have a question at the end, which is how many of those are U miles, and how many of those are the car going to be driving? And oh, by the way, the more U miles, the higher your rate. So, increases in autonomy are being likened, I think correctly, to a technological revolution. What will be developed and at what pace is a little bit unknown. But I think we're conveniently forgetting some knowns, and that is that humans do not perform well under stress. In combat, where service members are angry, scared, and tired, decision-making is not ideal, nor, at times, are the results. In the upper left, you see the sign outside the Dachau concentration camp. At the right are skulls from the Rwandan genocide. The bottom right are ceremonial graves from the Srebrenica massacre, later determined to be genocidal in nature. And in the bottom left, you see a picture from the Hamdaniya massacre, an incident involving U.S. Marines where following an improvised explosive device killing one U.S. Marine, the remaining Marines went on to kill some 17 civilians, none of whom were later determined to be a threat, and these civilians ranged in age from 3 to a wheelchair-bound 76. I think humans at times have a lot of nerve talking about human dignity. I'm open to at least the possibility that increasingly autonomous weapons may be more discriminating in certain circumstances than humans. And as a result, there will be increased protection for the military force as well as decreased risk to civilians. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much for two very provocative talks. We have a mic and we'll go around for questions, but I'm going to take the prerogative and ask one quick one of each of you. First to Mike Horowitz, you mentioned there were a number of sort of ways that autonomy can be considered. One is standalone weapons, the missile example, scaling all the way up into planetaries. Right? He said that that's the one that we should be concerned about, but that's the one where the humans involved wouldn't want to be replaced in any way. Why not? Right? Because what I'm thinking is that I look around, I look at new technologies like the IBM Watson. Right? If you think about the Jeopardy where they played against the computer, and the computer turned out to make very good decisions about how to process lots of information. So I could envision myself sitting on a planning staff trying to deal with a mountain of information, much of it unclear and open to multiple interpretations, and rather than trust my own flawed human judgment, turn it over to Watson. Right? So I'm just curious about why that wouldn't scale up necessarily in the future. The question for Chris Jenks is, if there was a ban on this, would it really matter at all? Given the conceptual gray areas that you did a great job of unpacking, given the fact that militaries might have very strong incentives just to keep doing their thing, even if the advocates of a ban succeeded, would anybody care? Would anybody listen? Would states feel bound to such a treaty?
So that's a great question. I think it's not that algorithms can't scale for planning purposes. It's that algorithms won't be making those choices themselves. And that's why I think if you, for example, look at a lot of the investments that the U.S. military is making right now as part of its, what it's calling the third offset defense strategy, there's a growing emphasis on human-machine teaming, essentially using the power of machines to improve the ability of humans to make better decisions. And operational planning, I think, could end up being a classic example of that, where you have essentially a traditional sort of staff system, like a bunch of like dudes in suits, essentially, and or military uniforms, actually, in that case, they're drawing from essentially the like Watson 5.0 to make judgments, but that the judgment will at the end of the day be in the hands of the person. I think in part for human nature reasons, humans wanting to have some control over their destiny. When you get to that level of aggregation, like making, since think about it this, you can think about this planning role in different ways. One would be, all right, we're going to go fight a war. Watson, tell me how to fight the war. Second would be, Watson, should I go to war? And it's that second question that I think you're unlikely to ever have a machine completely replace people, because war is a human endeavor, and humans will want to retain control over those ultimate decisions.
Yeah, Josh, in terms of would a ban matter, I mean, first off, under international law, countries, states are bound to which they've agreed to be bound. If you've signed up for something, you're agreeing to follow it. Now, there are certain countries do a better or worse job of following some of the agreements to which they sign. I will tell you the U.S. doesn't sign as many agreements, conventions, or treaties as other countries, but I think in part that's because we think through whether or not we are going to be able to follow through and live up to those. So, I mean, I think a ban, would matter. From my perspective, one of the reasons why there hasn't been a lot of movement towards a ban is because we're really mired conceptually about what it is we're talking about. It's very difficult to come up with a definition that would essentially ban the Terminator robot, but accept out the 1978 failing system and the 1983 Patriot system and a number of other systems. And so if our concern is weapon systems which can select and engage targets without future or further human intervention, it's challenging, to put it mildly, to phrase a ban that would only be prospective in nature. I do wonder, right now the human rights community frames the possible violation in the use of these systems. I wonder if at some point in the next 5, 10, 20 years, the human rights violation will be in not using these systems when you might otherwise could have.
Sorry, interesting side note here. The Terminator is arguably a semi-autonomous weapon, not an autonomous weapon. The reason is that if you think about the Terminator is, if a person sent the Terminator back in time, that would be a human designating Sarah Connor as a target. And then the Terminator goes back in time and Arnold does its business. But the Terminator may have terrible rules of engagement, but arguably a semi-autonomous weapon, not an autonomous weapon.
Thank you for clarifying.
I'm here to help.
You have a microphone going on, so please raise your hand if you have questions. Sir?
I know the military is currently working on a UCAV, which I believe is supposed to be autonomous. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So the UCAS program turned in there have actually just been some developments in that, and the Navy has sort of kicked the can down the road on that platform in particular. They're going to build essentially a drone that has some autonomous piloting features, but no weapons on it really, and does air-to-air refueling. So they've backed off some of the sort of higher tech dimensions of that system. But even if they built the higher end UCAS, it would have been autonomously piloted for things like taking off from and landing on aircraft carriers. It would not have autonomously fired weapons.
And I think that's one of the challenges. We'd like to be able to say, is a system autonomous or not? But it's not a binary equation. It really gets into functions and at different points in the operating cycle, whether a human's performing the function or autonomous. So it is very challenging to come up with generalized descriptors or labels as something as autonomous or not.
Thanks. Thank you both for great talks. This is a question for Mike, and it touches back on Josh's question and your comment about war as a human endeavor. I'm curious, how optimistic are you about political leaders' abilities to incorporate these new technologies and these moral concerns into the way we talk about war and decisions to go to war? Do you think we're going to be, how do you think this is going to be incorporated into kind of strategic discussions about the use of American power?
From an American perspective, what I think, similar to, one way to imagine it is similar to trends in society in general, in the way we talk about life in general being more data-driven. You could imagine some of that playing into the way that, presidents, start thinking about future decisions. But I think the degree, at the risk of making a terrible forecast now, the ability of a machine to accurately, sort of in real time with all the complexities, sort of predict exactly what would happen in a military campaign does seem sort of fantastical. On the other hand, Moore's law etc. I actually think the real issue here will come with non-democratic countries rather than democratic countries. And the reason is that non-democratic countries, fundamentally exist in a state of distrusting their own people. And so for an autocracy, for a dictatorship, sort of full machine control over the use of force, I think, is arguably a lot more attractive than it is for more democratic countries. Since if you're a dictator and you already fear your population inherently, the idea of being able to reduce your reliance on people and instead rely on the machines might seem actually very attractive, with potentially scary consequences for things like a repression, repression in those kinds of countries.
For 9/11, Al-Qaeda trained the people and hijacked the airplane and attacked. Is it easier to have the computer to control the drones and an attack than hijacking the airplane to attack? It's a real question, it's not a
Could you hijack a plane the way that you could hijack a car? There's been demonstrations.
Right. So yeah.
I think increased autonomy is going to solve and help in some ways and create all new and horrible problems, including the one that you just mentioned. Perhaps the spoofing or the hacking of an autonomous aircraft, of a train, or something else. I could certainly see that as as an issue.
And I think the challenge is that in some ways the autonomy can solve your hacking problems, but only if you turn over 100% of control to the machine and sever the data links. To hack, you need access to the system. You can just box the system and send it off to do its mission. And no one's going to be able to hack it then, because there's nothing to hack. In some ways, our desire for human supervision is what introduces the possibility of hacking. And so in some ways, the largest risk point is when you have systems with the most sophisticated autonomous capabilities and that data link, because that's when the consequences of hacking can be the largest.
You think of like the trains in Europe, where they're largely autonomous, but yet there is a data link. So you, on the one hand, are getting some of the advantages of autonomy, but also some of the risks. I found it very interesting that when the Jetwings plane, the Jetwings plane, human being with whatever mental health issues, deliberately, intentionally flies a plane into the mountain, the immediate response was, what we need after a human did that? We need more humans in the cockpit. And I just wonder if at some point we will maybe reach another conclusion, which is actually, how about less humans? But then you run into the dilemma that I think Mike has forecasted, which is unless you completely sever the human, which I don't think we're going to be prepared to do for some time, then you actually are having some risks.
Questions?
Hi, hello. My question is about, is related to this scene in American Sniper, where a child is holding a rocket launcher to the sniper, and he decides not to pull the trigger. So, do you think, like an expert, that at some point in the future, software is going to be making these kind of decisions? Also, what if it's proof that the software it's better at doing it than actual human beings?
I mean, I hear questions like that a lot. How would a system be able to tell when someone is trying to surrender? And I think one of the biggest challenges for machine processing is going to be things like context and emotion. And that's one of the reasons why I think that the last place you will see some of these systems is on the ground and targeting personnel. So, and it's because of that reason, because that is a very challenging endeavor in terms of recognizing, the 6-year-old with a toy gun versus an actual gun, or when someone is trying to surrender. But I push back at the notion that simply because systems are not currently able to do that we shouldn't develop any systems for use on any platform or theater. Again, I think it's going to be at water, at high altitude, and the extent they're at land, it's going to be swarming swarming offensive systems engaging swarming defensive systems. So I think the furthest obstacle is the challenge that you posed, which is autonomous weapon systems primarily designed to target personnel.
I think that's basically right, and the context that I would add is that I'm not sure why is the wrong question. In some ways it sort of goes back to my response to Evan's question. One of the challenges here is that you could build a simple autonomous weapon now. I mean, you could go to an engineering, I'm sure there's an engineering lab here where some, like enterprising students could essentially take a gun and something that could, essentially like heat detection and some tracks and, set it up. So like, all right, when you detect something that's like between 97 and 100 degrees, fire the gun. Like you could roll it out on the boulevard. That's possible now. Militaries generally don't do that because they, that wouldn't comply with international law for it's a terrible idea. But it's only a terrible idea if you actually care about only killing the right people. And I think one of the big challenges as the technology develops is that for a country like the United States, I think Chris is absolutely right that the last place that we would ever see the machine making the decision is exactly that scene in American Sniper, because we think that human judgment is so important and the ability to show mercy. We believe, who knows how technology will evolve, we believe will be the hardest thing to program. I think one of the challenges is that when the technology is good enough that the sniper could, where the machine sniper could do that, there are lots of other countries around the world that may not be so interested in protecting civilians that might be all too eager to deploy those kinds of technologies. There's a little bit of fear to go along with my don't worry about the Terminator.
So I want to ask another question to you too, Mike, about strategy and the sort of broader strategic implications of these technologies. When you're president 20 years from now, 25 years from now, and autonomy has progressed to a certain extent, how might that actually change your calculus about whether to go to war in the first place? There are already concerns that the proliferation of drones make war cheap and easy for any leader to do. Would the advent of really sophisticated, discriminating, autonomous systems lead you even further down that path, creating an image that war somehow is bloodless and not the last resort, but maybe one of the earlier resorts?
I think it probably depends. It's a great question. Sorry, I'm still just trying to imagine anybody being foolish enough to vote for me for president.
Hey, we'll vote for anyone.
I set you up for that one, didn't I? I think it probably. I think that it certainly does make war bloodless, but only in some circumstances. I think part of how it would change the calculation depends on how symmetrical the spread of this technology is. I mean, I tend to think, for my presentation, that these are technologies that could actually spread pretty quickly, and where it will be more difficult, that things like robotics and autonomy will be things where it will be more difficult for any country to maintain the kind of relative gap that the United States has maintained between itself and other countries over the last few decades, just in this particular technology area. And if that's true, and we're talking about like robot v. robot, then I certainly think it will lower the barrier to using force. I think that it also lowers the barrier to using force when it's our robots versus like other people, in part because American soldiers aren't in danger, and if part of what you're worried about in any given military operation is your soldier's dying, then yeah, you're going to maybe take some risks that you wouldn't take otherwise. But to the extent that you're worried about, say, the reaction of other countries to their people dying, I think that's one of the fundamental things that plays into the decision to use force to escalate in the first place. And so that factor would still be there. It's only if you had in a symmetrically proliferated world, though, then essentially it's like, whatever, I'm a professor, I'm obviously a huge dork. I remember some random Star Trek episode where there was like a machine that told people from both sides to like go into the box and die or something. It was like their play on how mutually assured destruction was silly. Like then you're kind of in that world, except no people are dying at all. And at that point, like the only cost of war is material. So then maybe, so like playing that out strategically, then you're making decisions about whether to go to war, about trying to exhaust the economic base and exhaust the material base of another country, rather than sort of destroying their ability to fight with people. So it leads to a different calculation, I think. Maybe. I don't know.
Hello. Hi. This question is for anyone. I guess I want to ask a moral question, but I don't know how to frame it, so there's no frame for this. Just answer it how you will. But what is the displacement of accountability that you are referring to or talking about? What does that mean on a human level? Just some things that I was thinking about. Perhaps it means that there's a decrease of PTSD if in the context it's human-to-human interaction and you replace it with robot-to-human interaction. But it could also mean an increase in isolationism and xenophobia and maybe a desensitization to death. So, I don't know, just answer.
I'm tempted to have the lawyer go first.
I'm in law school.
Well, a couple things. You often hear this issue about accountability held up as part of the support for the ban. Like, who would be accountable when there's an untoward event? And I think that really, again, it's somewhat of a fool's errand to get too caught up in debating a future system which does not and may never exist. But I note that we have a number of semi-autonomous systems now that are performing a wider range of functions. We have ways of dealing with that accountability. Essentially, if the commander who has ordered the cruise missile strike or has essentially ordered the strike is the one who is most likely facing accountability. You touched on an interesting point that I'm not sure if and how I can work on this in some future research, but I wonder about if using these systems will help in one area that we don't really talk about a whole lot, and that is the area of moral injury. I think a lot of people misunderstand that it is exceedingly hard to have members of the military intentionally killing other human beings. In fact, that is essentially what the military does. It is breaking you down. It is deprogramming you in a sense from your very natural, innate aversion to willfully, intentionally taking human life. Anyone who that's an easy task for, they are sociopaths. So there is a tremendous moral injury that comes from even the most lawful of wartime activities, killing an enemy belligerent. There is a moral price that service members pay, and I wonder if that price might be lessened if it wasn't the service member using force.
I would distinguish in some ways between accountability, which I think of as more of a legal thing, and responsibility. And I think that one of the challenges in this sort of debate and discussion is that sometimes we get really caught up in thinking about, all right, what is the machine going to be doing, and miss the real question is, what do we want humans to be doing? And that in some ways what we want is that when somebody is taking human life, that there's a person that feels responsible for that. Of course you need legal accountability. Obviously you need legal accountability. But that there's responsibility for that. And so I think the concern comes if the person is so disconnected, not geographically, because that's been going on for decades, not geographically, but in the decision-making chain, when the person is so disconnected from the actual sort of other person dying on the other end, that the person who orders it doesn't feel responsible for that anymore. That, I think, is the potential point where even somebody like me gets concerned and thinks that it's one of the reasons why, and this in some ways goes back to your prior career, why I think that as autonomy is more integrated into militaries around the world, including the American military, the critical thing is actually going to be sort of training and education to ensure that that sense of responsibility remains, regardless of the specific accountability rules that get set up.
Any other questions?
I thought you brought up a good point about first, power countries with these autonomous systems fighting each other, one machine against another. And as we've seen in past wars, it's the loss of life that finally a country says, okay, we're done. So is the fear of the killer robot, enthusiast that a country like the U.S. or China who would have the technology would go to, say, like Africa or a country that doesn't have the means and use these autonomous systems to kill their people and not put our people in jeopardy that way? Is that one of their fears in how we could use this technology?
I think that is, and part of that, if you talk to some of the people involved in the campaign to stop killer robots, I actually think even though this isn't about drones, I actually think drones are part of what motivated a lot of this, and that you have people, essentially you have sort of human rights campaigners that have seen what the United States and other countries have done with drones, and they realize they can't stop that now. Sort of the cat's out of the bag, horse out of the barn, whatever analogy you want to use. And so they want to stop whatever they think is next and would be even worse. And so I do think there is that fear. But when you talk to the NGO groups, the single biggest case that I've heard them, the two biggest cases that I've heard them bring up, one is the idea of a soldier, sort of soldiers breaking into a house and trying to figure out if there are insurgents there or civilians. And the idea of like, how's a robot going to make a decision? And it always goes back to your question, that like kind of American sniper scenario. The second is essentially the drone use scenario, where the drone is autonomous. And instead, the drone is searching for people from an ethnic group, or the drone is searching for, particular like classes. And so they worry about things like, ethnic cleansing becoming easier through autonomy. I think that's the more sort of concrete. I think that's the fear more than the fear that any particular country will use it for a military edge. They're much more focused on the human rights implications, or what they view as the human rights implications, than the sort of operational implications.
This question is for anybody. So basically, a lot of this deep learning and the work that people are working on now has to do with like neural networks, and so it's modeled after the human brain and our nervous system. And so when you talked about how they can perform in ways that humans cannot match, like in the parking lot, and how we don't perform well under stress, is that why we're more concerned with using this technology like out over water and or underwater and over air now?
I mean, I think that's part of it. It's if something goes wrong with an anti-sub killer robot, if you work through what are the possible outcomes, it's a bad outcome for bad guy sub, bad outcome for a good guy sub, bad outcome for a whale. So there's less risk of harm to civilians. I do think though that we are collectively, I think we're a little irrational. I think irrational about our attitudes towards both our levels of performance and the machine autonomy that is already in place. I mean, when you get on, who here has any real concerns about the manner in which you get from terminal A to terminal E at DFW? Because it's not because there's a human operating that train. It is largely autonomous. And when you get on that plane, what percentage of the functions do you really think that American Airlines pilot is performing?
All of them.
And that helps Josh.
This explains so much.
I would tell you that it is Less than 1%. And most of those functions are being performed only because we think people would be freaked out. But some of the planes are capable of taking off and landing themselves. I mean, I've talked to some pilots who have acknowledged that essentially the plane takes off and then the books come out and you read a chapter, and every couple of moments, every 5 to 10 minutes you look over and you learn that, oh, by the way, about 100 miles back, there was an issue that came up. The plane identified it, fixed it, and is just letting you know all of that in advance. But if you were to tell people, hey, there's no one flying this plane, I think we would all be freaked out. The reality of it is, humans in a lot of ways are almost a placebo in a number of systems. They're there, they make us feel better, but they're not performing, frankly, a whole lot of functions. If it makes us feel better, then yeah, by all means, keep a human in the cockpit, so to speak.
Just on the drone area, just on that, by the way, if you want to look for a growth area where drones may become increasingly prominent, think cargo flights. Like why, with civilian airliners where there are people on them, like people would get freaked out. But FedEx, UPS, Postal Service, whatever, there's no reason if it's just sort of cargo being hauled around. Those are probably the first places where the FAA is likely to approve remote piloting.
Although when I had dinner with a FedEx pilot, and I tried to politely, and he got we fly in the same airspace and everything else, but you see the same thing with trucks. The Army is developing a fleet of driverless trucks, but it only envisions them performing logistics functions, because it would be creepy if the driverless truck were transporting a squad of soldiers. And that's fine, but you what? I mean, if a driverless truck shows up and delivers something, and oh, by the way, that is your only means of getting out in a bad situation, watch how everyone climbs in the back of the driverless truck. So we're going to continue with this somewhat irrational attitude towards autonomy.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I have a question. You guys are experts. How much do you think the drone programs in Pakistan and Afghanistan have been effective? As a journalist that covers specifically counterterrorism and terrorism in that particular area, I know for a fact that all they do is they keep shuttling the terrorists. They keep shuttling between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And to me, it's a failed program. Mostly, dealing with collateral damage and very little amount of actual perpetrators. How do you think we can incorporate that? Do we need more human intelligence? Do we need... Because of two factors that I think, one, their ability to live with and mingle with the civilians, and the other, the terrain. So, anybody? Actually, both, I'd love to hear from both of you.
I mean, on the one hand, I think we have to acknowledge that drones are capable of considerably more distinction and discrimination, and can be much more precise. I do share Mike's point that a lot of the campaign to stop killer robots is post-drone angst at how they were unsuccessful. Human rights groups have been unsuccessful, staggeringly so, I think, from their perspective. Heck, there are now drones in the United Nations on peacekeeping missions, although unarmed. So on the one hand, these drones, the Reaper offers the ability to be far more discriminating and to limit civilian casualties. On the other hand, I think there's a very real question about it lowering the bar to using force. If you were to take the thousands of drone strikes that have occurred over the last handful of years, and you were just to say, it turns out drones don't exist. So those events are only going to happen if you were to fly in Delta Force or a SEAL team to conduct those missions. How many of those drone strikes would we have been willing to conduct if there was risk to U.S. military personnel? I think far less. So I think there is a question about lowering the barrier in terms of using force, but at the same time, they're capable of employing force far more discriminatingly than previous systems.
I would just add that I think it's a great question, and I think part of it gets to the heart for me as a I don't know, it's whatever, I would almost say frustration in that I think that we too often conflate the policy of targeted killing with the tactic of using drones. And it's I think the policy of targeted killing and specifics about it that have led to some of the things that you've mentioned. It's not clear to me that drones specifically are the either cause of or solution to any of solution to these problems. On the one hand, they're better at discriminating. A drone that's been loitering for a week has a much better sense of whether, say, the people in the house are actually sort of insurgents compared to, say, an F-18 pilot that flies over for a minute. But whether that strike should happen in the first place is a whole different question. It's a policy question, and I've been, while I'm a staunch advocate of the U.S. investing more in some next generation systems, I also personally think that it would be better to be a lot more transparent about American policy in this area.
Well, on this last point, there is a difference between policy and technology.
Right.
And this question, this debate is really quite crucial. As with other technologies that we've experienced in the past, it's important not to let the technology get out in front of the bigger questions about what you want your strategy, your policy, what are your ethical requirements with the use of any technology. I think our speakers have done a marvelous job of giving us an outline of some of these big questions, these big issues, and your questions have helped a great deal. So thank you all very much for coming and join me in thanking our speakers.